I shouldn't have worn that dress. It was a deep emerald green, the kind that hugged my body in all the right places and dipped just enough at the neckline to be provocative without being outright inappropriate. Ethan had bought it for me years ago, but he hardly noticed when I wore it now. As I caught my reflection in the mirror, I told myself I was wearing it for him, to remind him of the spark we used to have. But when Caleb's eyes lingered on me across the room, it became clear that I wasn't the only one noticing. We were at Ethan's family home for the weekend, a tradition his mother insisted on, a way to bring everyone together. Ethan's younger brother, Caleb, had just returned from years abroad. I hadn't seen him in so long that I barely recognized the man standing in the doorway when he arrived. He was taller, broader, his once boyish grin now replaced with a confident smirk that seemed to carry an unspoken secret. "Lauren?" he said, his voice warmer than I expected as he pulled me into a hug. His cologne was subtle, woodsy, and entirely too distracting. "It's been too long." "Welcome home," I managed, my voice catching slightly as I stepped back. His eyes lingered for a beat too long before he turned to greet Ethan. I shook off the moment, reminding myself that this was Caleb, my brother-in-law, the boy who used to pester Ethan and me for rides to the mall. But the way he looked at me now was anything but boyish. Dinner that evening was loud and lively, filled with stories of Caleb's travels and his plans to settle down now that he was back. Ethan was in his element, catching up with his brother, and laughing in a way I hadn't seen in months. I smiled and played my role as the supportive wife, but every so often, I felt Caleb's gaze on me. It wasn't overt, it was subtle, just a second too long, but enough to make my skin prickle. "Still cooking up a storm, Lauren?" Caleb asked suddenly, pulling me into the conversation. I nodded, setting down my glass of wine. Someone has to keep Ethan fed. His smirk widened, his eyes twinkling with something I couldn't quite place. "Well, he's lucky. Not everyone has someone who takes such good care of them." Ethan laughed, oblivious to the tension I felt tightening in my chest. "Yeah, she's a keeper," he said, throwing an arm around my shoulders. I smiled, but Caleb's words stayed with me, the tone of them echoing long after dinner ended. Later that evening, as everyone settled into their rooms, I found myself in the living room, tidying up the remnants of the night. Caleb walked in, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were far more defined than I remembered. "You don't have to do all that," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I don't mind," I replied, focusing on stacking the plates. His presence made the room feel smaller, the air heavier. Still the perfectionist, he teased, stepping closer. "Some things never change." "And some things do," I countered, meeting his gaze for the first time. His eyes were dark, filled with an intensity that made my breath catch. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between us felt charged, the kind of tension I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice softer now. "It's good to see you again, Lauren." "You too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but it wasn't the carefree grin I remembered. It was softer, more personal. "Good night," he said, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned and left the room. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, the echo of his presence filling the silence. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But deep down I knew better. The way his hand had brushed mine as he passed, the way his eyes had held mine, it was too much to ignore. That night, as I lay in bed beside Ethan, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the way Caleb had looked at me, the way his voice had softened when he said my name. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was overshadowed by something else, something I didn't want to admit. I turned to look at Ethan, his breathing steady, and even as he slept beside me. He was a good man, a great husband, but somewhere along the way, we had lost something. The spark we once had felt like a distant memory. buried under years of routine and familiarity. And now Caleb's arrival had stirred something in me I thought I'd buried too. The next morning, I resolved to put it all out of my mind. It was a fleeting moment, nothing more. But when I walked into the kitchen and found Caleb there, his hair still messy from sleep, and his smile easy and warm, my resolve began to falter. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that made my chest tighten. "Morning," I replied, busying myself with the coffee pot. I felt his eyes on me as I poured my cup, and it took all my willpower not to look up. "You look nice," he said casually, though there was nothing casual about the way he said it. "It's just a dress," I said quickly, brushing past him to sit at the table. But even as I sat, I could feel the tension between us building, unspoken but undeniable. The day passed in a blur of small moments, each one adding to the weight between us. A lingering glance here, a casual touch there. It was subtle, but it was enough to keep my heart racing. By the time dinner rolled around, I was exhausted from trying to keep it all at bay. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone in the living room again, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Caleb walked in, his presence filling the space like it always did. He sat down beside me, his knee brushing against mine. "Lauren," he said, his voice low, his eyes searching mine. "I need to say something." My heart pounded as I shook my head. "Caleb, don't." "Why not?" he asked, leaning closer. "You know there's something here. You feel it too." "I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This is wrong." But even as I said the words, I knew they lacked conviction, because in that moment, with Caleb so close I could feel the warmth of him, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to stop. The next morning, the air between Caleb and me felt heavier, though no one else seemed to notice. Ethan chatted over breakfast, completely unaware of the tension crackling beneath the surface. Caleb was quieter than usual, stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. I tried to keep my focus on Ethan to remind myself where my loyalty belonged, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the moment Caleb and I had shared in the living room. After breakfast, Ethan decided to head into town to pick up some supplies for a barbecue. "You two okay to hold down the fort?" he asked, grinning as he grabbed his keys. "Of course," I said quickly, my voice a little too bright. I avoided looking at Caleb, but I could feel his eyes on me. Once Ethan was gone, the silence in the house was deafening. I busied myself in the kitchen, wiping down counters that were already clean and rearranging the same stack of dishes. Caleb leaned against the doorway, watching me with a faint smile. "You always keep yourself so busy," he said, his tone light but carrying an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. "Someone has to," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my hands trembled as I placed a plate back on the shelf. "You don't have to do all this, you know," he said, stepping into the room. "Ethan's lucky to have someone like you." I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "I'm just doing what anyone would do." "That's not true," he said, his gaze locking with mine. "Not everyone would." His words hung in the air, and I felt a pang of guilt. I wanted to brush it off, to tell him he was wrong, but the intensity in his eyes made it impossible to speak. "Caleb, we can't," I began. He cut me off. "I'm not trying to make this harder," he said softly. I need you to know how much I admire you. How much I always have." I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as my heart raced. "You don't mean that." "I do," he said, his voice steady. "I mean every word. Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why now?" "Because I can't keep pretending," he said, stepping closer. "Not anymore." He closed my eyes, willing myself to stay strong, to remember who I was and what I had. "Caleb, you don't understand what you're saying. This is wrong." "Then why does it feel so right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, my chest tightening as I met his gaze. His hand brushed against mine, and the warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me. I pulled away quickly, my breath coming in short bursts. "This has to stop," I said, my voice trembling, "before it goes too far." "Maybe it already has," he said, his tone soft but filled with meaning. The rest of the day passed in a haze of avoidance. I stayed outside for hours, tending to the garden, and pretending I couldn't hear Caleb moving around inside. But even as I tried to distance myself, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the way his presence filled every room he entered. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found Caleb on the porch. He was sitting on the steps, a glass of whiskey in his hand. I hesitated, debating whether to join him, but he looked up before I could retreat. "Hey," he said softly, gesturing to the spot beside him. "Come sit." I sat down, keeping a careful distance between us. The silence stretched, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves. "I'm sorry if I made things awkward earlier," he said finally, his voice low. "It's fine," I replied, though my tone was far from convincing. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said, turning to look at me. I can't help how I feel." "Caleb," I began, but he interrupted me. "Just hear me out," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know this isn't right. I know I shouldn't feel this way. But I do, and I can't pretend I don't." His words sent a wave of emotion crashing over me, and I struggled to find the right response. "This isn't fair," I said finally, my voice breaking. "To Ethan. To any of us." "I know," he said, his hand brushing against mine. "But I can't help it." He pulled away, my chest tightening with a mix of guilt and longing. "We can't do this," I said firmly, standing and stepping back toward the door. "This has to stop." "Well, stop," he said softly. "If that's what you really want." I hesitated, my hand on the doorframe. His gaze held mine, filled with an intensity that made my heart ache. I wanted to say yes, to end it before it went too far. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned and walked inside, the weight of his gaze following me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my mind. I told myself I had done the right thing, that I had drawn a line that couldn't be crossed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, I woke up feeling as if I were carrying the weight of 1,000 secrets. The guilt, the confusion, the unspoken emotions, it all sat heavy on my chest. I knew I had to put distance between Caleb and me, but every time I thought about how his hand had brushed against mine, how his voice had trembled when he spoke, my resolve faltered. Ethan had a meeting in town that morning, leaving Caleb and me alone in the house again. "I'll be back in a few hours," Ethan said, kissing my forehead before heading out. I nodded, avoiding Caleb's gaze as he stood by the counter, sipping his coffee. Once Ethan was gone, the silence in the house was deafening. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to organize the pantry, while Caleb lingered in the living room. I could feel his presence even without looking, and it made my heart race. "You don't have to avoid me, you know," Caleb said, his voice breaking the quiet. "I'm not avoiding you," I replied, though we both knew it was a lie. "You are," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "And I get it. This isn't easy for either of us." I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "Caleb, we can't keep doing this. It's not fair to anyone." "I know," he said softly, his gaze steady, "but that doesn't make it any easier to ignore." The tension between us was palpable, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering dangerously close to falling. Caleb took a step closer, his hand brushing against the counter as he leaned in. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "It doesn't matter," I said finally, "because nothing can happen. But it already has," he said, his voice trembling. "You know it has." He stepped back, shaking my head as my emotions threatened to overwhelm me. "Caleb, this has to stop, before it's too late. What if it already is?" He asked, his gaze locking with mine. "What if we've already crossed the line?" His words sent a jolt through me, and I felt my breath catch. He was right, of course. We hadn't kissed, hadn't touched in any way that could be deemed inappropriate. But the emotional line had already been crossed, and there was no going back. That afternoon, I decided to leave the house for a while, hoping that some fresh air would clear my head. I wandered through the woods behind the cabin, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet the only sound. But even out here, far from Caleb's piercing gaze, I couldn't escape the weight of what was happening. When I returned, the house was quiet. The only sound, the faint hum of the air conditioner. I stepped inside, my heart racing when I saw Caleb standing by the window, his back to me. He turned when he heard me, his expression unreadable. "Ellie," he said softly, his voice pulling me toward him like a magnet. I hesitated, my hands still on the doorframe. "Caleb, we need to talk." "Do we?" he asked, his tone both gentle and challenging. "Because I feel like we've already said everything without saying a word." He closed the door behind me, stepping into the room. "This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. "You know that." "I know what we're supposed to do," he said, stepping closer. "But that doesn't change how I feel." "Stop," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. "Ellie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "tell me to stop, and I will." I stood frozen, my heart pounding as his hand moved to cut my cheek. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as if he were waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I closed my eyes, my breath catching as he leaned in. When his lips brushed against mine, it was as if the world fell away, leaving only the two of us. The kiss was tentative at first, a question more than an answer. But when I didn't pull back, it deepened, all the tension we'd been holding back spilling over in a wave of emotion. When we finally broke apart, I stepped back, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. "Caleb, we can't." "I know," he said, his voice shaking. "But I can't stop." I looked at him, my heart breaking under the weight of what we'd just done. "Ethan will be back soon," I said, my voice barely audible. "We need to forget this happened." "Can you?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "Because I can't." I didn't respond, my hands trembling as I turned and walked away. But even as I retreated to the safety of my room, his words echoed in my mind. "Can you?" And the worst part was, I didn't know the answer. The hours after that kiss felt like a blur, a mix of guilt, confusion, and a longing I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on anything else, cleaning the already spotless kitchen, folding laundry that didn't need folding. But nothing could quiet the storm in my head. My mind kept replaying the way Caleb had looked at me, the way his voice had trembled when he whispered my name, and the way I hadn't stopped him. When Ethan returned later that evening, I felt a pang of relief mixed with dread. His presence was grounding, a reminder of everything I was risking. He greeted Caleb with a slap on the back, the easy camaraderie between brothers making my stomach twist. I busied myself with preparing dinner, avoiding Caleb's gaze as he lingered nearby, his presence a constant weight in the room. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. Just tired." "You've been working too hard," he said, kissing my temple. "Relax tonight, okay?" I nodded, but relaxation felt like the last thing I could manage. During dinner, Caleb was quieter than usual, though no one but me seemed to notice. Every time he glanced in my direction, I felt my cheeks flush, and I prayed Ethan wouldn't pick up on the tension. Afterward, when the dishes were done and the house had quieted for the night, I retreated to the porch, hoping the cool evening air would calm my nerves. I wasn't alone for long. Caleb stepped outside a few minutes later, his footsteps soft against the wooden planks. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low. "No," I said, staring out at the darkened woods. "Too much on my mind." He moved closer, leaning against the railing beside me. "I know I've made things hard for you," he said softly. "And I'm sorry." He shook my head, my fingers gripping the edge of the railing. "It's not just you, Caleb. I don't know how we got here. Neither do I," he admitted. "But I know I don't regret it." His words sent a jolt through me, and I turned to face him. "You should. We both should. And I don't think you do either." The intensity in his eyes made my breath catch, and I felt my resolve wavering. "Caleb, this isn't fair. To Ethan, to any of us." "I know," he said, his voice softening. "But that doesn't change how I feel." The silence stretched between us, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on me. Finally, I broke the tension, stepping back toward the door. "Good night, Caleb." "Ellie," he said, his voice stopping me in my tracks. "Don't do this." "Don't push me away." I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "What do you want from me?" "Honesty," he said simply. "I just want you to be honest. With me. With yourself." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I shook my head and walked back inside, leaving him alone on the porch. The next day, the tension between Caleb and me was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark waiting to ignite. Ethan noticed my distraction, though he chalked it up to stress. "You've been quiet," he said, wrapping an arm around me as we sat on the couch. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He kissed my forehead, his touch gentle, and I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it made my chest ache. Caleb walked into the room then, his eyes flicking between us before he looked away. The air grew heavier, and I excused myself, retreating to the kitchen under the guise of making tea. Later that evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, I found myself in the living room, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the space like it always did. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. I hesitated before nodding, gesturing for him to sit. He didn't, instead moving to stand in front of the fire, the glow illuminating his features. "This can't keep happening," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to stop." "I know," he said, his tone unreadable. "But do you want to stop?" His question hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. "It doesn't matter what I want." "It does to me," he said, stepping closer. "It matters more than anything." I stood, putting distance between us. "Caleb, this is wrong." "Then why does it feel so right?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Why does it feel like we're exactly where we're supposed to be?" "Stop," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "Please." But he didn't. He reached for my hand, his touch sending a shiver through me. "Ellie, I'm not trying to hurt you. I can't pretend anymore." I pulled my hand away, my heart racing. "Ethan will never forgive us," I said, my voice breaking. "If he finds out." "He won't," Caleb said quickly. "I won't let him." The conviction in his voice made my chest ache, and I felt my resolve crumbling. "This has to end," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Tell me to walk away," he said, his gaze piercing. If you mean it, I'll leave right now. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence between us was answer enough, and Caleb stepped closer, his hand brushing against my cheek. "We're playing with fire," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Then let it burn," he said softly, his lips inches from mine, and in that moment, with the firelight dancing around us, and the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders, I gave in. The cabin was silent, except for the soft crackling of the fire. Caleb's breath was warm against my skin, his hand still gently cupping my cheek. I knew I should pull away, end this before it went too far, but I couldn't. My body refused to move, caught in the gravitational pull between us. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though he were waiting for me to stop him. But when I didn't, the kiss deepened, and all the tension we had held back came rushing to the surface. His hands slid down to my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. I felt the heat of his touch through the thin fabric of my dress, every nerve in my body alight with a sensation I couldn't ignore. "Ellie," he whispered against my lips, his voice trembling. "Tell me you want this as much as I do." I couldn't speak. Words felt impossible, but my actions spoke for me. My hands found their way to his chest, and I felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my fingers. It matched the frantic pace of my own, as though our bodies were perfectly in sync. The firelight cast flickering shadows across the room as we sank to the floor, our movements slow and deliberate, as though we were both afraid of breaking the moment. His hands found the hem of my dress, fingers brushing against the bare skin of my legs. I gasped, the sound echoing in the quiet cabin, but I didn't stop him. Instead, I let myself get lost in the way his touch felt, the way he whispered my name like it was the only word that mattered. "I've wanted this for so long," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I never thought it would happen." "Neither did I replied, my breath catching as his lips found the curve of my neck. "But now that it has, I can't stop." Hours passed in a haze of whispered words, lingering touches, and stolen moments. Every barrier we had built between us crumbled, leaving us exposed and vulnerable in a way I had never experienced before. For the first time, I felt truly seen. Every flaw, every fear, every hidden desire laid bare under Caleb's gaze. But as the fire died down, replaced by the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the windows, reality began to creep back in. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me as guilt and fear started to settle in my chest. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. Caleb sat beside me, his hand reaching for mine. "We figure it out," he said simply, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "Whatever it takes, we figure it out." I wanted to believe him, but the weight of what we had done felt like too much to bear. "Ethan will know," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "He'll see it on my face." "Well, be careful," Caleb insisted, his voice steady. "We'll take it slow." But I shook my head, the enormity of the situation crashing over me. "Caleb, this wasn't just a mistake. This was a betrayal." "And I'd do it again," he said, his voice firm. "Because what I feel for you is real, Ellie. This isn't something I can walk away from." Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the quiet. Panic set in as I scrambled to gather myself, fixing my hair and straightening my dress. Caleb stood, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the window. "Go upstairs," he said quickly. "I'll handle this." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "We can't let him suspect anything." "Ellie," he said, his voice softening as he cupped my face. "It's going to be okay, I promise." But his words felt hollow, and as Ethan's footsteps echoed on the porch, I felt my heart sink. Dinner that night was suffocating. Every glance, every word felt heavy with unspoken tension. Ethan, oblivious, talked about his day in town, while Caleb and I exchanged fleeting looks that only deepened my guilt. I couldn't help but wonder if Ethan could sense it, if he noticed the way my hands trembled as I passed him the salt, or the way Caleb avoided meeting his gaze for too long. Afterward, Ethan went to bed early, leaving Caleb and me alone in the living room. The silence between us was unbearable, but neither of us dared to speak. "I can't do this," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending." "Ellie," Caleb said, his voice filled with emotion, "we'll figure it out. Together? But at what cost?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. "Ethan doesn't deserve this. And neither do you," he said, stepping closer. "You deserve to be happy, to feel loved." I looked at him, my heart breaking under the weight of his words. "This can't end well, Caleb?" "Maybe not," he said, his gaze steady. "But I don't regret it." The weight of what Caleb and I had done pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. I knew things could never go back to the way they were, but I also knew I couldn't let go of what had happened between us. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I made a decision. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Thank you, dear listener, for following this intense and emotional story until the very end. What do you think about the choices made by our main character? Was she right to give in to her emotions? Or should she have fought harder to preserve her loyalty and her marriage? This story of forbidden love, betrayal, and the consequences of crossing boundaries leaves us with so many questions about love, morality, and the lines we draw in relationships. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you sympathize with her situation? Or do you think her actions were inexcusable? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales about human connections, secrets, and the complexities of relationships, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. More captivating stories are on the way, and we can't wait to share them with you. Thank you for being part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring life's untold tales.